The hearing will be filmed and streamed live. Recording and transcript will be published afterwards on the State Assembly website. I would ask any members of the public who have joined us in the room today, do not interfere in the proceeding, and as soon as the hearing is closed, please leave quietly. I will begin with the introductions. Deputy Ina Gardiner, President of the Scrutiny Liaison Committee.
Deputy Helen Miles, Vice President, Scrutiny Liaison Committee. Deputy Louise Dublé, I'm Chair of the Health and Social Security Scrutiny Panel.
I'm Deputy Catherine Curtis, the Chair of the Children, Education and Home Affairs Scrutiny Panel.
Deputy Tom Coles, Vice Chair of Environment, Housing and Infrastructure.
And thank you, Chair, for your warm welcome. Deputy Lyndon, Farnham, Chief Minister.
And your team?
Ian Gorst, Assistant Minister of Treasury and Resources.
Richard Bell, Treasurer.
Andrew McLaughlin, Chief Executive.
Paul Wiley, Group Director of Policy.
Thank you. And the main aim of this public hearing is to establish and to have a conversation, it is a conversation, Chief Minister, to seek your views on the rationale, how this government budget has the capacity, capability and resilience to deliver for the people of Jersey. Mm-hmm. The themes that we will go through after some general questions will be around people, services, funding and risks. So I'll start with first general question. Would you, Chief Minister, let us know how have you and your Council of Ministers put this budget together? So what was the process?
We've had a process of engagement with officials, approximately 10 meetings, which ran through the whole process, which led to the production of the budget.
Okay. Can you give us specific actions that were taken within the budget to ensure that it meets outcome of the future Jersey vision, as you mentioned during the public hearing through comments at the corporate services?
I think the driving force or the catalyst, whichever way you're going to call it, for the budget is the corporate strategic policy, which was approved by the state, which is linked to the future Jersey vision. So we've really those were the foundations of the budget. And
can you give the specific actions or specific examples or specific projects that can demonstrate what's happening in the budget that will ensure that it meets future Jersey vision?
For example, let's look at something like extended nursery care and child provision in relation to the future Jersey work, sustainable wellbeing aspect. The extended child nursery care comes under the community wellbeing aspect of that, and in Island outcomes that supports children. And all of the 13 key priorities in the common strategic policy reflected in the budget relate are attached to the future Jersey outcomes. Another one, for example, the transition to a living wage, that comes under economic wellbeing and affordable living. Okay. So we've linked all of the work streams to those priorities.
Thank you for
ambitions, I should say.
Thank you for your answer. It looks like the budget is focused on CSP, Common Strategic Policy, priorities and objectives. The question is, what assessment have you undertaken of the medium and long-term impact of this approach may have, for instance, on more important strategic service and other matters that fall outside of CSP? So the CSP is 13 priorities, but there are several longer strategic matters. How it's addressed?
So I think the aim of the budget really is to prioritise essential services and the immediate challenges facing islanders. We want to balance the budget. We want to address the exponential growth. We want to curb expenditure. The budget has grown exponentially over the last 6 years. I think there's been, the Treasurer can correct me if I'm wrong, in the region of £500 million increase in expenditure. So really, first and foremost, we are addressing that because we found ourselves, if we didn't do something to address that in an unsustainable position. So underpinning, the work that the CSP, the focus on pushing expenditure towards areas in the CSP, we've also balance that with curbing the growth.
So
across
would you
various
consider
sectors.
this as an austerity budget?
No.
But once we are curbing, where are the cuts coming from?
So there's a difference between cutting and curbing. Some areas we're looking at replacing services, some areas we're reducing services, some areas services will be discontinued because we want to focus.
It sounds like austerity.
It does sound like austerity.
Well, I think
Where are the services reduced and where the services, where they moved from? Which services were reduced and which services were added?
well, I'm not sure I've got a
Because
a
you
full list
mentioned
here.
it, so
Yeah.
I try to understand what does it mean in practice.
So in practice, we're looking to prioritise expenditure. We're looking to prioritise expenditure to where it's going to provide the most benefit for islanders, for example, of helping with the cost of living, of affordable housing, living wage, extended nursery care, and so forth. The business as usual activities across the public sector with specific focus on healthcare, education, infrastructure. We're curbing the growth to right size the senior management structures of the public sector and rely less on external consultants. Those are just some examples.
It's interesting that the budget remained the same budget and there is an actual growth. But what we'll do, I think, we'll start to get into the details. Let's move to the people. Let's kind of explore a bit more and we'll go around amendments and now we'll move to Deputy Duble.
Chief Minister, what analysis have you undertaken to establish the impact of this budget on various groups in Jersey, various demographic groups?
Well, the analysis has been based around supporting those less well off in our society. You see most of the increase in expenditure has moved towards the lower income sectors. Mm-hmm. There's a good analysis of that held through various departments, not least Social Security, who front the work to assist those sectors.
Okay, so within...
I mean, just the entire budget is focused on maintaining frontline services and making sure that there's an increased apportionment of the overall budget going into those services, hence the growth in health funding, and right-sizing, or you might use the word cut, right-sizing those central functions which have grown over the last number of years. Now, that can't be described as austerity because the overall budget is growing. What we're doing is right-sizing those central functions or reducing them, constraining them, and making sure that there's growth in money for those services. So I think you can make an argument that says the service provision is going to see increased funding throughout this budget because that's what the government's priority is.
Right, so you're focusing on low-income islanders. Thank you for that. In terms of perhaps groups within that demographic, single parents, for example, disabled islanders, women, what impact will this budget have on those particular groups?
Well, the budget, it's difficult for me to pull out specific impacts on those if you break it down to that area, but the overall budget is aimed at, like I said, helping the sectors of our society that need the most help. And I refer you to our CSP priorities.
So would you say that single parents, for example, are a sector of our society that need the most help?
Off the top of my head, I couldn't say single parents need the most help. Some single parents would need more help.
They're the biggest group in relative low income in Jersey.
We've got to go back to, which we've sort of missed, and I know we discussed this at Corporate Services Scrutiny Panel, you go back to the risks that the community is facing. So you've two risk registers that we've got in government, so the community one and the corporate one. You're seeking in allocation of resources to deal with those internally, we call them tier one risks, but fundamental risks. So that's why you've got money focused on the fire risk in schools, and you're dealing with those issues. If you're talking about, what you're trying to do is then subdivide it by demographics and of individuals in our community. You can look at the work that Education Department's doing about providing free school meals. That was a priority of the previous government. This government's picked that up and continues to run with that for all the same reasons that the previous government thought it was a priority, because you are targeting that money then at the most vulnerable members of our community. One would expect, although we obviously don't have all this data in front of us because we could have done previously, one would expect that single parent households would be, generally speaking, lower income households, and therefore receiving the benefit of school meals, for example. We talk about vulnerable female members of our community. We continue to do that work on the violence against women, which the chair there started and set us on that track. This budget makes sure that there is resources allocated to do that as well. Pensioners, if you take pensioners, the pension is being upgraded because we've still got that triple lock in place. So as you look through all of those things, you can see the rationale of particular projects which are focused on particular vulnerable members of our community.
So thank you for that live analysis, but has that analysis been carried out in any of those 10 meetings and on a more cohesive level, backed up by officer advice and data, or is it just now that you're producing and this thinking?
Well, I don't do live analysis. I'm just you've asked me a question. I'm answering the question.
Has it been discussed in any of the 10
really
meetings?
say that's live analysis.
So I mean, I'm not sure you at the development, the series of workshops that council ministers went through to agree the budget, the principle of the budget, the higher level budgeting, the correlation to the corporate strategic policy, did not drill down, as you wouldn't expect it to, into all of those levels, because it would have just been impossible to do at that level. But that's work that ministers were doing separately between the workshops. Ministers were going away and consulting with officials and coming back, and that's how we shaped.
So how will you analyse the impact of the budget as if it's approved? How will you analyse the impact of it on these
I wonder
groups?
if Paul could talk about
So
it.
the Chief Minister describes in that kind of safe space of policy development within our ministerial submission templates, there's a specific section for equality considerations, border protector characteristics, children's rights, and then the sustainable well-being and community economic environment. So as the Chief Minister was describing, each minister was responsible for developing those their 13 priorities, and it was brought together in the budget.
That's kind of what I was trying to get at without saying that was a policy that I created in the previous government. But I want to know if that thinking is being carried out at ministerial level. I understand that it's there in the officer steps, but I want to know at that highest level in COM, are those vulnerable and groups that have particular needs in terms of budgeting and services, are those groups being considered? And if they're not, is that something that you can commit to do on an ongoing basis to analyse how this budget is helping islanders and introduce any further measures if necessary for those groups?
Well, of course, we take the second part of that question first. We want to make sure that we analyse the results of this budget and the work and the CSP, because that's how we reshape and improve things moving forward. So we will pay special attention to analysing how the budgetary impact on our society works or doesn't work in some circumstances. I'm confident that all of the ministers are very engaged with all of their work, especially the ministers closely aligned to the areas that require the most impact: social security, education, health, housing, completely engaged and have worked extremely hard to help us shape this budget.
But of course, Chief Minister, it's you as the Chief Minister with the overview. If we're talking pensioners, single parents, that's not one ministerial portfolio, is it? Is it fair to say that you're aware of the economic situations of those particular groups, and it's something that you
I
are?
like to think I am. There might be the odd gap in my knowledge here and there, but I've tried to be as engaged as a full minister as we possibly can. But if we've missed something, then we might have done. But we've tried not to. We've tried to make this budget, more so than many budgets that have gone before, focused on helping those less well off in our society and helping all islanders deal with the cost of living. And that's why, that is the sole reason why we have reprioritised the budgeting as we have.
Yeah, I was just going to add before, from what Deputy Dublé was saying, that it just seems slightly odd that there's all this statistical data showing which groups of people are particularly badly affected, like you said, single parents, pensioners and so on. That's not a starting point in some way, rather than looking at it afterwards. So, yes, well, this bit that we're thinking of covers that, and rather than it being a starting point.
Well, I mean, it depends on the circumstances of individual single parents and all families, but single parents will potentially benefit from extended nursery and childcare provision, from the school meals programme, from the reduction in GP fees, from the implementation of all of the recommendations in the Violence Against Women and Girls.
But it's not a starting point. Can I ask you, how did the Council of Ministers consider the impact its proposed budget would have on child rights? Because, you know, at the moment, when we bring any proposition, we have to do a child rights impact assessment.
Yes.
So in the actual budget...
The budgets have.
So,
So there's no requirement to do one on the whole of the government plan or budget, as you know, but where it's directly engaged children's issues, there was careers that were published alongside.
So they've all been published.
okay, so it's not considered, as every decision is made, just certain
In
things.
those related to the children.
If I may, to go back to the earlier question, it is considered in the policy development space. If it's the law requires us to actually do a screener in all cases, but actually only produce a children's rights impact assessment where it actively engages children's issues.
Okay.
Okay, can we talk about health now, please? Do you feel that this budget tackles the health inequalities that are present in our island, and on what basis?
Could you perhaps explain the health inequalities?
So, whereby different islanders with different characteristics have different levels of health outcomes. So, have you prioritised your spending accordingly?
That ultimately is a question for the Health Minister, who's can't be here today. We didn't realise he was required until I read it in your email yesterday. So apologies. That's something I can't answer, but because I can't go into the detail, because my knowledge on the health service is not at that level, although I do work closely where I can with the ministerial team at health. But health is one of the key priorities, not least because there's a lot of sorting out that needs to be done, restructuring, reorganisation, almost a reinvention of the health service, which the team are getting into, of course, supported by our biggest ever capital spend on the new hospital, plus a significantly increased budget, which we're continuing to do through the course of this budget. So from a funding aspect, I'm relatively confident that we're providing the resources for them to provide those assurances, but I can't give you the details.
Thank you. I'll focus in on one area where there are health inequalities, and that's in the area of women's health. And the output from government the planned output has been reduced. Can you comment on that?
Sorry, what's been reduced?
So the women's health strategy is not being produced, and there are areas that were raised in the consultation that women on the island feel the services that government are providing need to be improved. Has this budget taken account of that?
I couldn't tell you. We need to have a health minister here for that.
Wouldn't you agree that given women are 51% of our population, that their health is something that across the Council of Ministers should be a priority?
I can't disagree with that. But you'd need to there is a rationale for the thinking behind the health team, but you'd have to ask them for that.
As
rationale.
Chief Minister, do you support the Health Minister having the budget that he needs to deliver the necessary services for women's health?
Well, it's difficult. Of course I do. In principle, I do. For women's health and men's health and children's health, I mean, for the health of all Ireland, of course I do. We want the health service to be properly resourced to deliver health right across the community. But where there are areas that need specific or additional support, then that's a matter for the team now. The reason I can't quite remember what they're doing with this, but I'm not.
Can you
I'm
just
not sure
clarify?
they.
Sorry, that you said that's a matter for the team. Who do you refer to?
The health team is Deputy Tom Binney, and the Assistant Minister is the Deputy Barbara Ward, Deputy Rose Binney, and Deputy Andy Howell. And they've been working on that, but I can't recall off the top of my head where they are with the women's health strategy. I know they might be producing it. I'm not sure where they are with it.
Okay, we're still on people. 2 quick questions before we'll go to Deputy Curtis and Skills. You have mentioned twice, obviously, and it's completely right during your answers about providing the childcare. Do you remember, or do you know, if it's in front of you, how many hours of the free childcare or subsidised childcare islanders can expect in 2025, and for what age?
I don't have it in front of me, actually.
Okay, no, can we follow it up to?
We have talked about it, but I can't remember.
Okay, because it is important to understand the budget that was allocated. What does it mean in practice? How many hours for what ages? Second question.
Can I add on? And how many families are benefiting from the additional needs funding for the 2 to 3? Because as I understand, it's not universal funding that's being proposed in this budget, but it's targeted funding. How many additional families this year will receive
Again,
that?
I don't have that information, but the service is being introduced in phases, so we can bring the resources.
No, what I'm trying to understand is we have a budget for 2025. What does it mean in hours and families support? So if we can have it later on, it's fine. Yeah.
We can make a note of it.
And another quick question. We talked about the children a lot, about the pensioners. If you have, or your team have on top of your, 3 things, top things that government is doing to ensure that pensioners in Jersey have a decent standard of living. 3 things that different this year, in 2025, I mean.
In relation to the budget.
Yeah, so what budget doing different? So, because we did have extensive debate last sitting, and there were so many things mentioned, how pensioners feel, because there are so many things could be changed. Is it anything, this budget, what within this budget would be different for pensioners?
Well, we're trying to bear down on the cost of living for all islanders. I'm not sure I can point immediately to any specific line in this budget that sort of directs to any particular, without notice.
Yeah, I understand. That's what I ask. If you have on top of your head, it's fine. If not, it's fine.
It's difficult, but you could again, you can look at where we're putting money in line with our common strategic policies, the work that the Social Security Minister is doing across that portfolio. She's made some changes recently which have provided more financial support to the less well-off. Ian, do you want to?
Well, only, Chief Minister, you keep asking, Chief Minister, about specific demographics. If pensioners are going to benefit from the increased funding in health, tens of millions of pounds, this year we'll be spending, next year, £322 million in our health service. That's focused on all of those areas where people are currently either experiencing delay or lack of service. And we know the demographic that uses the hospital, so they're going to benefit there. They're going to benefit from reduced GP fees as well. So it's, whilst we might want to categorise everybody out, and I have no problem with that, but they are things in this budget that are going to be benefiting. I've only thought of 2 off the top of my head.
Thank you.
But they are going to be benefiting pensioners, like the Chief Minister said.
Yeah, I think, and we'll go into the house budget when we go into the funding, but around the people, it's helpful. Thank you, and we'll move to skills.
Yeah, okay. So one of the government's CSP priorities is to increase lifelong learning and skills development. Can you explain what you and the Council of Ministers are expecting this priority and the associated funding of 1.158 million in 2025 to achieve?
Not off the top of our head. I mean, it's rather difficult to deal with this without any. This is a rather unique occasion. It's the first time I think SLC have convened a meeting like this, and we can certainly take a note of that question and come back to you. But I mean, this is really, perhaps we should have got all of the Council of Ministers here, and we could have answered those questions.
Might need a bigger room.
Yeah, I know. Yeah.
One point that I expect you could answer is, as it's a CSP priority,
Yeah.
1.158 million doesn't seem much.
But without having the minister's programme in front of me, I can't remember that detail. Sorry.
Okay. Can you tell us about your understanding of the cost?
If any of the officers remember, you just shout out. Yeah.
So Deputy Ward is developing that. It's a CSP priority. The budget is for next year in its development phase. And of course, he'll be bringing forward proposals to the Council of Ministers and then to...
But we don't know
Just a minute, you have a budget, but you don't know what you would be deliver on the budget. It's in development stage.
It's developing because you need to know...
Why it's 1.1 and why not 2 million?
You need to know how you're going to develop. You've got Skills Jersey already, as you know. You've got the apprenticeship schemes. It's decisions that have been taken in that space.
Yeah.
Okay. I was going to ask about the understanding of the cross-government working that's needed to support an objective like this. So how does that work?
Andrew, do you want to?
And understand, can you just clarify the question?
So we were just talking about the lifelong learning and skills development, and this can cross between different departments. So how does it work when working out budget for this cross-ministerial work? How is that done? Is there a set process?
I mean, in setting the overall CSP, each minister obviously worked with their team on their priorities for government. So they had to prioritise before they came to the, if you like, the bigger table to prioritise. And in that specific instance, if you're using the example of that policy in Deputy Ward, this was an area where he felt the government could make meaningful progress during what is a very short term that it's got effectively 2 years. And he will convene with, and officers will convene with relevant departments across government to bring the policy to life once it's finalised. So I don't think, just like if you take another example, the living wage, you had a lot of engagement, particularly between the economy minister, between the CLS minister, others and their officers to work up that policy and look at the costs and benefits of the different options within it. So this is just a normal working of government. As the Chief Minister said, we've had 10 workshops of the COM. Behind those workshops there's a huge amount of cross-departmental working by officers and individual ministers to prepare papers for that COM, to prepare the research for that COM. So I think that's just the normal workings of government.
Yeah, well, I mean, this particular example is very much part of the economy minister's interest as well, isn't it?
If I can expand on that, there's a specific ministerial subgroup of COM, which is the Housing and Work Advisory Group, where the Economy Minister, the Lifelong Learning Minister, Justice, Home Affairs and Social Security and others convene on a monthly basis to balance out those population and skills and migration issues. Because you're right, they do overlay, particularly with the economy.
Okay. So what consideration has the Council of Ministers given to the viability of student finance grants for the future? And this must be something of a priority to make sure there's professional.
I know, but these are questions with the greatest of respect. You need to be asking to the relevant minister.
Well, we do, on my panel, we have asked the Minister, but it seems that it goes to a higher level where the Council of Ministers as a whole and the Chief Minister would be concerned about whether people are going to be professionally qualified to fulfil posts in the island.
Of course, and we've agreed the high level policy on supporting increased provision of lifelong learning. But with the best will in the world, and I wish I could, but we simply cannot, without notice of questions, give you detailed answers on other ministers' portfolios. So I mean, we take the question down and we can go to the education minister and ask him to provide that. But
As a panel, we've already asked the education minister, so what we want to know is whether the Council of Ministers and the Chief Minister has something to say about the training opportunities for people in Jersey as part
It's
of the
more about
overall
your
plan.
views and vision. It's not about the data because because the ministers do need support from the Council of Ministers and the Chief Minister.
So these documents are Council of Ministers documents. Didn't used to be like this. They used to be Treasury Ministers documents, but it was changed. So as you've asked and indicated, each minister comes to the Council of Ministers, and ultimately you've got the common strategic priorities, you've got the risk registers, so you are going back to those first principles that you were talking about. You've got the long-term vision for Jersey, and you have to prioritise those things, and you have to compromise and until you get to a document that the Council of Ministers support. But if you want to ask questions on individual ministers' portfolios, for which they are legally responsible, then we support what's in the document.
I think it's more about really the vision and the views and less about the exact, because we're asking about the things that within the common strategic policy. This is like we are not asking about the whole ministerial portfolio and what within the amendments. But what I would suggest, because you mentioned the services, we'll move to the services and the questions exactly around the services and specific amendments that I assume we discussed the amendments and the services.
Yeah.
No, you started.
did I mention the services?
Yes, you said that some services out, some services in.
But
One of the answers.
Come on then.
So unfortunately, you did mention that some services were going to be
You did.
cut as
Right.
of your reprioritising.
Okay.
You have also mentioned that you don't actually have a list directly in front of you. So I suppose my first question is, would that kind of list be available? Is that something that you have a
Yes.
record of what you are going
Yes,
to be?
so following a written question, where a lot of the information has been provided to scrutiny, officers are consolidating that list now for you.
Okay.
It's not quite finished. We're nearly there with that, but we'll let you have that. So we've consolidated into capital programme changes, and that shows you the increases in capital and where we've reduced. I say reduced capital. We put in place a capital programme that we can deliver, rather than overstating or over budgeting it and getting lots of carry forwards. And the same with new revenue investment. We're listing the new revenue investment and areas where we're reprioritising, reducing or removing certain things, but we're tending to sort of move our focus from, we're sort of, if you like, right-sizing the management structures, we're sort of right-sizing the back office functions, to help curb the growth in expenditure, but then to put more money to the front line.
I assume that you'll have done like your full risk assessment of and risk-based analysis of these roles, which will be reduced and.
Well, yes, we have this significant risk assessment. We've got our community risk register and the corporate risk register, and that's been guiding us right throughout the process. I don't know if any of the officers, Paul, would you like to add anything to that?
As you were saying, in the corporate risk area, for example, IT and cyber have been historically underinvested, and that's a deliberate choice by this Council of Ministers to prioritise that, because it underpins so many of even our frontline services.
Yeah, I mean, it would be good with any list that you can produce if you were able to include the corporate and the other risk analysis or what next to it, because that information is good to know that you've chosen to stop
For
or
example,
reduce a project.
An example of community risk is the increased investment in fire safety in school improvements in schools. That's one example. That's quite a big £6 million, I think, investment.
So one that came from the panel that I'm here representing, the Environment, Housing and Infrastructure, was around Fort Regent. there is a concern from within our panel, and so why we brought the amendment about the line of head of expenditure around that Fort Region is very much considered a public asset. But we're aware that feasibility work is being carried out by SOJDC. So I suppose the additional line for the new head of expenditure was to ensure the public that any funds and expenditure on that is to consider this asset still a public asset, or confirm whether or not it's going to be more pushed towards SOJDC as an operator for the site.
It will remain a public asset. SOJDC are helping with it because they have the expertise in
Yeah, I
that
think it's
particular area.
important to remember that you set SOGDC up as the development company of the government. So this is very much in their sphere of expertise, and you would expect us to allocate that work to the party best able to manage the risk of it, which is them, and they are themselves owned by the government. So I'm not sure about the distinction between public and social and private you're trying to make, but it is a public asset and it's a public company set up to be a development company that's doing the work, which I think would seem reasonable.
I think the fear or the concern, more reasonably put, is that SOJDC's model is more acquire, develop and then sell on, where rather than develop and retain and operate. So this seems to be a slight change in their model from, at least from my perspective and the perspective of the panel, and maybe the wider public see that SOJDC are develop and sell, and then they utilise funds for other things around. So that's the concern.
I mean, I don't know if that's been shaped by the fact that they've become so synonymous with the development out of the waterfront and so forth, but definitely they have the skills to undertake this piece of work.
So there's absolutely, just to be clear, there's no plan to hand over the Fort Regent to the development company for them to do as they wish with it. So it will remain as a public asset, and they're helping the government through the regeneration steering group put the plan together.
Yeah. And
It
so
will remain a public asset. There might be some commercial aspects as part of it, but it will remain in public ownership.
of course, I'm trying not to push too hard, because I say without the appropriate ministers being here to answer the
I can
appropriate
try,
questions.
but
Can I just zero in on something? You said there might be commercial aspects. Are parts of Fort Regent going to be sold off?
no, not sold off, but there could be restaurants up there leased out to commercial owners. There could be a hotel, there could be a cinema.
Are there any parts that are planned to not be accessible by the public, for example, ramparts or?
No, I think the ramparts are a big part of the potential of Fort Regent.
There's a potential that will be closed off to the public if you don't do something.
Anybody wants that?
I think it's a good plan to harness the benefit of some of the previous development and invest it in, trying to give a long-term future to Fort Regent. There's an issue that we need to think about accounting when it comes to the head of expenditure, because I'm not sure it really perhaps does quite what the panel were thinking. But
Just to go back, there's potentially access to parts of the fort that you'd never ever thought there'd be access to, but hopefully we'll be in a position soon to bring members
reveal.
up to date. Yeah, to
We'll
reveal
look
what's going on.
So one of our other things we had within our panel briefings with the infrastructure minister was around funding for a skate park that wasn't included within the 2025 budget, but apparently funds have been found and allocated. So I suppose the question is we want to know where these funds sort of came from, and then how are they fitting in within the ambitions of the Council of Ministers and for other projects.
So I'm looking to Andy. Yeah. Do you want to come and talk? Can you?
On perch, I think. So would you just repeat the question to make sure I answer it as fully as possible?
So there's the panel, my panel have been aware of the project for the town skate park, which funding wasn't anticipated in the short term and not included within the 2025 budget. So are you satisfied that the budget within the states members are debating is accurate, reflecting funding and spending requirements for 2025?
So my understanding, and again this is Yes, that's the one. So the skate park itself, in the budget as it was lodged, was reprofiled towards the back end of the plan. So there was funding that remained in the plan. But as some panel members will certainly be aware, the government plan establishes what we call groups heads of expenditure, which allow projects to move backwards and forwards in time if things change. So if projects become ready quicker, they can move forward in the plan. If other projects obviously consequently delayed due to planning, etc., they may move backwards. So that flexibility is built in to try and maximise the amount of capital that can actually be delivered to deliver benefit for the island. So the skate park, I think, is one of those examples where if there is space in that programme due to the group head of expenditure, it could be brought forward. And I believe that's the conversation that the Minister for Infrastructure has been having and looking at.
And so is it safe to assume that that same rule applies for the list of other delayed or postponed projects that have been supplied by other ministers within their portfolios?
So in most cases, group head of expenditure is still for a purpose. So if you had a project which was completely unrelated to that purpose, you wouldn't necessarily be able to use it, although the Treasury Minister obviously has powers to reallocate between heads of expenditure as well. So could look at operating those powers if needs be. That needs consultation with other ministers who are responsible for their heads of expenditure.
So thank you, it's really helpful. So if I understood it correctly, because the skate park project was ready, the funds were reallocated after the government plan was lodged. So based on this principle, is, for example, Lascay is ready to go, would be opportunity and possibility to allocate funding to make sure that Lascay deliver, because other projects are still within the purchase, development, feasibility studies, because Lascay was much more progressed compared to other centres.
So on that specific example, sorry, I'm just trying to make sure I'm
asking about the principle, because we don't have details, and I don't think that it's right to go into the details at what stage each development. I'm asking about the principle.
Yeah, the principle. So the SCAE, for example, the example that you've used is a separate head of expenditure and a separate major project. So if you were to bring the SCAE forward in the plan, it would probably involve the minister making a transfer from another head of expenditure. So that is possible under the public finances law. The minister has those powers, but it couldn't be done just within a group head of expenditure because it exists in its own
And
right.
Fort Regent, we don't have heads of expenditure.
The Fort Regent does not have a head of expenditure. That's the
It's not
amendment
major project.
that was referred to.
So
Okay.
the proposal is that SOJDC will develop Port Region within the company, therefore it doesn't require the head of expenditure. And when the plans are brought forward, so will the funding also.
Okay, bit complex. Okay, well, let's move.
So
Yeah.
So just the Children Education and Home Affairs Scrutiny Panel lodged an amendment that requests funding for refurbishment work at Highlands College that's brought forward. Chief Minister, what are your views on the way government assesses and prioritises the maintenance of publicly owned buildings? Does government have sufficient oversight of this?
Of course, the property management of public buildings is run by Property Holdings Limited, and I know that's an area where the infrastructure minister is, I think, wanting to make some improvements. I don't think it's a surprise. I think most politicians around the table will know that I think we haven't really maintained or managed our property portfolio adequately in recent years, and that's something that the government, led by the infrastructure minister, is looking at now, how we perhaps reprioritise that. But I think the answer to your question is we could do a lot better.
Yeah, no, that's good. And for example, I was wondering if more weighting is given to buildings that children use, for example, because it seems to be more important that a public building used by children would not be falling apart more so than some other.
Well, I'm not sure how Property Holdings weight their investment plan or programme, but certainly I would hope to see that we will, if we start to introduce firmer policy around putting the children first agenda, and certainly from the discussions we have around the Council of Ministers table led by the Education Minister, we are very keen to make sure the investment in the whole of the children and young persons infrastructure is a higher priority. But without an official weighting sort of formula, as you like, we're mindful of that in line with previous states' decisions, and that's what we're working towards where we can.
When will that be realised?
Well, it's being realised now in the decisions we make every day, but there are possibly still gaps in that. That's sort of, I think, policy and development.
So will the next budget have a weighted formula?
I couldn't say at this stage.
But is that something that you would like to
Sure,
achieve?
we can discuss it. And again, I think the two relevant ministers, the Children's Minister and the Education Minister, will have something to say on that, but I'm not sure where we are with it.
Yeah. You say with the infrastructure ministers looking at property holdings, and he's like I say, he's discussed with our panel about improving the SLAs between them and varying other bodies. If through his work the minister says that JPH needs to have a large scale review and maybe a restructure, is that something you would support and allocate budget for?
I absolutely would. And that's something we've been discussing, Andrew. I don't know if you'd like to
I
provide a
think
bit more
I think
background around that.
The panel have touched on a really important area. I think it's well known amongst all members that for a long period of time, the maintenance budget available to the department or to JPH relative to the size of the asset base has looked like it wasn't enough, which means that the budget over time, I think it's just inevitable in any life cycle maintenance model, over time your limited budget will be at the mercy of events, emergency repairs, things that crop up in the risk register and so forth. In fact, I appreciate you don't have the capital programme yet, but you'll have it very soon. I think you'll see there's a lot there in buildings that children use that happens, but you'll also see that you're responding to events like fire and safety, which might take you away from some other form of routine maintenance you were planning, and that's part of the story at Highlands College. So I think we all regard the current situation as very unsatisfactory, and the minister's working closely with officials to see if there's a more strategic or structural solution to that, to break out of this pattern where government finds it very difficult to fund the maintenance of its own buildings, and even when it's well intentioned, it finds itself at the mercy of events. I think every elected member who looks at this area finds it unsatisfactory, and the minister's working hard on structural options, which he's probably alluded to at your panel.
Okay, thank you. So we move now to funding area. Yes.
Thank you. Okay, so Chief Minister, how do you maintain oversight of spending where it crosses over two departments, for example, where a policy around children in SIPES might result in more spending in health services for children?
Treasurer?
Have you got a specific issue in mind?
I mean, I just gave one there, a policy around children that might impact on the health budget, but it's more about the ways of working. How do you maintain that oversight across all your ministers, given that there's so many issues that overlap?
The budgetary management.
Yeah.
I'd expect that work starts at policy development, and invariably does, in terms of when we're bringing forward policies to identify the cost implications in differing departments arising from that. It's fair to say we'd like to strengthen that, because often we might see in the past where legislation comes forward and we haven't properly costed out what the implications of that are into future years and across different departments. That's something that we've been looking to improve in the last year, and moving into this legislation programme in particular, the Council Minister is keen that the likely financial implications, once regulations are subsequently lodged with the Assembly, are identified up front when you're preparing the legislation.
And how far ahead do you do that work?
So we have pieces of legislation that are coming through ELT.
What I mean is, how far into the future do you look when you're planning the budgets?
Well, the legislation programme would be the far end of the table, but then as the legislation comes through, and goes to the Council of Ministers, so you've got a legislation programme for the 3 years, more concrete in terms of what's coming in the coming year or two. As those comes through, we'd like to cost those so that we can identify into the future what the likely financial implications will be. So the intent would be that you're looking across the period of the government plan.
Okay.
So if we know we've got legislation that came last year. We want to plan in those increases in spend going forward. Equally so with items in the upcoming legislation. I've had conversations, for example, with the Home Affairs Minister related to the legislation coming through in respect to violence against women and girls that says what are the likely financial implications going to be once that legislation comes in. So through that implementation period that we're doing that.
Yeah, and Chief Minister, how do you, just going back to your vision, how do you juggle all of this to make sure that it's the output is aligned with your vision as Chief Minister?
I think we do that just through constant discussion and management of our policies, the expectations. We have to balance that in line with resources, in line with process. It's an ongoing, evolving. It's something you don't do and then you sit back. It's something that's always evolving because we get new challenges every week, every month, new budgetary challenges, unexpected circumstances, propositions, budget amendments that can suddenly change the picture while we're while we're getting a momentum. Paul, you want to?
And just expanding on that legislative programme that Richard was describing, I think this year has seen the most concerted attempts to balance that and match the demands to capacity. As a previous corporate services scrutiny panel, we described the fact that on average there's a capacity ceiling of about 50 or 60 pieces of law or regulations. Actually, there was 129 pieces that were bidding for attention in this Council of Ministers, and it requires rigorous prioritisation by the Council of Ministers to determine which are the ones that are matched to their common strategic policy, first of all, and then matched against those other tier 1 risks. And that's what you end up with.
Yeah, and I would like to move to bring our attention and maybe to expand on Deputy Dubley question. When we talk about the balance, and you mentioned yourself, we all know that most of the requirements and most heavy budget we have within the House. We can see 76 million gross over the 4 years. I remember last year for this year we had increase of 50 million when other departments needed to make savings, and they overspent 30. I don't know what's the latest number. Maybe even more this year. Recently, we know that you increased the budget, and we did have a conversation around the Public Accounts Committee. It was a public hearing when we tried to understand if it's structural deficit or it's how the service run and what efficiency needs to be put in place. Why I'm asking this, and this is why it is important, because I understand when this budget was prepared, health demand was very high when other departments needed to make savings / cuts up to different numbers, but it's up to 20% at the most. Now, how we are, for example, a further 5.5 million, and I'm looking at the Treasury, on top of the sum already provided for the proposed budget is likely to put even further strain on other public finance. What is the plan to address this, given recent statement made by the Health Minister that he might need to ask Treasury even for the more assistance? So what you are doing to make sure that the health budget is sufficient, but at the same time is managed?
Yeah. Chief Executive.
Yeah, I mean, so I think the question is specifically about health. As we said in another place, across all of these things, as Paul alluded to, I think for the first time this year, we have definitely been guided by and evaluated the government's programme against island-wide indicators and the risk registers. That's one part of the process. We then had very detailed workshops around money, people, IT resource, project resource, legislative time to make sure that you could actually do the things you said you were going to do, because, as I've said before, governments in Jersey have a reputation for not doing the things they said they were going to do, because it turns out the resources can't be deployed. Even when you've got the money, you can't actually get the work done. So we try to bring all those things to bear. Specifically in health, the ministerial team are still well advanced now with a period consultation with all the groups in health about the structure of the health service, about how it can be best set up for the future. There's been specific issues in health which I think we're observing the same trends in other jurisdictions, large and small, around drug price inflation, around the availability of essential workers. We are at the mercy of what is actually a global healthcare market for workers. If you look at the inflation and the costs in our health service, they're driven by the two things I've just mentioned there. The availability of workers, many of whom are locums or contracted some way. Drug price inflation, again, a global phenomenon driven by events beyond our control, is another factor. Then the third thing that we're facing, which again I think you will understand, is that the health service in Jersey has historically developed relationships with a large number of providers off island, typically other hospital trusts or hospitals for specialist services. All of those hospital trusts in England are under enormous financial pressure, and they're increasing their charges for services they provide to other places. So what we're facing, particularly post-COVID, is a very significant and sustained increase in all the input costs of running a health service. What we're trying to evaluate, and it's difficult because we're still in the middle of it, is the extent to which this is a temporary phenomenon in the immediate aftermath of COVID, and given the things that are happening in the world that are driving up the prices of drugs, or whether it's actually something that's a permanent change in the price level, and that requires a response from us. So it's a very dynamic situation.
So when we would know how much sufficient funding is required to run Jersey Health Service, because it feels like nobody knows what's the number.
How long is a piece of string? It's the same question. You know, health spending, health needs, the things you can spend money on in health are almost infinite. And I think the FPP, when it came to Jersey, made the point to all of you that you can never spend enough on health, so you have to be rationed by your budget and what you think you can afford. And that's what we're trying to do, is get those two numbers in line for our health service and all health services. The past 3 or 4 years have been extremely difficult because those three big input costs I mentioned have skyrocketed in terms of inflation. So I think it's important everyone recognises that in health, which is a global market, we're a small jurisdiction, to a large extent at the mercy of events. We don't have any control over most of those prices, and we're already operating with a significant disadvantage in that we don't have any economy of scale. We're not big enough to have an economy of scale in purchasing. We're not big enough to sustain broad clinical practices. We have to form partnerships with other places. So all of these things make it actually quite difficult to be terribly precise about the cost of providing healthcare in Jersey.
Yeah,
and that's what the ministerial team are working through. We want it to be better, but I think you should recognise the context in which they're operating.
Yeah, and the health panel, and I believe all of SLC understand those challenges. I think what the President asked was, is the funding sufficient? And she also asked, is it being well managed to achieve those positive outcomes? So, Chief Minister, how are you ensuring that, okay, maybe we can't say what the sufficient funding is, but how do we ensure that the funding going in is well managed to achieve those positive health outcomes?
I rely on the reassurance of my officials who I engage with regularly and the ministers. And I think Chief Executive has described the challenges really well. And I'm also reassured recently with various changes that we are getting on top of the management. It's becoming much more productive, much more efficient, given the challenging circumstances. Andrew, I don't know if you just wanted to.
Yeah, I mean, I think
briefly to that. Okay, fine.
Just a minute.
So, Chief Minister, so in terms of clinical standards and do you have high expectations for the health services in Jersey?
Sorry, what was it? Do I have high? Of course we do have. We have the highest health expectations. Of course we do.
Okay, and in a public hearing with the Health Minister, in order to meet those high expectations and the increased need that the Chief Executive has described, the Health Minister noted that difficult decisions will need to be made around raising funds for health. And he said that it hadn't been identified where that increased funding is going to come from in the future. Can you comment on where you think it could or should come from?
I believe it should come from general taxation.
Okay. And how are you satisfied with the health financial recovery for the proposed budget plan? Have you seen the financial recovery plan?
Well,
have you discussed financial recovery plan around the Council of Ministers?
we have discussed it. We've discussed health funding regularly at Council of Ministers. I'm as satisfied as I can be at this moment in time.
Are you confident it will work?
I'm relatively confident, but I'm also a realist. And in line with some of the challenges, those challenges are still there. They're not going
understand.
away. It's not helped by the fact that we are operating in a substandard, hospital, and all the facilities are. They're adding to the problem. So the sooner we can get on and build.
If you already mentioned the hospital, just I would rely for the scrutiny panel, hospital scrutiny panel amendment, calling for separate heads of expenditure to be created for Overdale, Kensington Place, and the Sanseria Health Village. Do you support the principle of creating separate heads of expenditure of interest of the openness and transparency?
Of course, I support the principle. You might remember when I fought hard to try and get the previous government to give out the same information. The previous government came up with the argument that they weren't going to put out figures that could compromise our negotiating position. So I support the principle, but I also want to make sure I align with the Health Minister when we talk about the timing of that information. That information needs to be made available at the right time.
No, that was, I think that the question is here, do we need different heads of expenditure for 3 actual sites that would be delivered?
I'm not.
Or maybe non-Overdale parts needs to be separated from 710 million. Whatever is Overdale is Overdale. We don't need to go into the details what within the Overdale.
When we have our completed health estate, we need to find the most efficient and productive way of managing that expenditure, whatever that will look like. And Ian.
I would even be more robust than the Chief Minister. The previous government, for all of the reasons we understood, kept one head of expenditure. If we move away from more than one head of expenditure now, we give away. Yes, of course we did.
It was only one site. We never discussed the Sanseria Health.
No.
It was Sanseria Health
No,
Village
no,
wasn't
no,
on the
come on.
plans.
There was one head of
Somewhere
expenditure
the one.
to do more than one site, and the rationale for that was that what happens in government is you get bids up to the maximum amount, and if we are to seek to get the most competitive price for all of those works, we keep the one head of expenditure. I can understand the Chief Minister saying there will be a time when that can go into the public domain. I'll leave it to others to decide when that time should be, but I would, for all of those reasons, robustly defend sticking where we are with one head of expenditure.
And would we have the workforce plan for all these facilities in place? Because it hasn't been, shared or publicised, because it's different workforce plan for 3 sites.
Yeah, the workforce, we were quite advanced with the workforce plan at the end of the last project, so that will have been adapted. And I'm sure it's being.
But it's different to operate on one site and on 3 sites.
Yeah.
Okay, but let's move on to
By the way, the offer is there to keep scrutiny on a commercially confidential basis, completely updated of all the costs.
No, it's appreciated. Tom.
Yeah, okay. So I'm answering this more from the EIA panel's perspective. Their panel has been informed that an agreement as to the size of the reduction in grants and the amount to be granted in 2025 between the ALOs and the Government of Jersey has not yet been finalised. Given the proximity to 2025, what impact does this lack of agreement have upon these organisations?
Well, again, I'm going to hand over to Chief Exec in a minute, but I think we've agreed the principle almost. I think there are still some slightly different ministerial thinking on this to be ironed out, but we've had a model of ALOs that for the last 10 years has worked, I think, generally reasonably well, but it's certainly time to revisit that to making sure we're getting the best value of money, and that is the policy of this government. We're going to do that. We're going to revisit that. If necessary, restructure some of the ALOs. We might see some merger of ALO, we might see closer working, sharing of resources. But Andrew, can I? So that's the principle.
Repeat the question, sorry, what's the...
Sorry, bear with me. The panel had been informed that an agreement as to the size of the reductions of grants and the amounts to be granted in 2025 between these ALOs and Government of Jersey has not yet been finalised. Given the proximity to 2025, what impact does this lack of agreement have upon those organisations?
Again, going back to where we started, I think it's important to say that what we're trying to do is curb the growth in public spending, not cut public spending, two very different things. I think we can sometimes get our language mixed up. The budget is growing, we're trying to curb its growth. We went through a few years where the growth, as the Chief Minister said, I think 505 million since 2017. The growth of the public sector outgrew the growth of the economy in many years, which isn't obviously a sustainable thing to be happening. And this Council of Ministers wanted to try and curb some of that growth, at least bring the two things closer into line. We thought it was sensible when we were going through that process and working out how to put that in place, primarily to fund the priorities of the government, that if we were visiting a curbing of growth on public service and on departments, we obviously ring-fenced some departments, health in particular, that we should visit that on the very large and one might say complex estate of ALOs that we've created over the past 15 or 20 years in Jersey. So that has been shared out by ministers. If ministers are saying that there's still in individual discussions about the numbers, then that's probably a matter for them. What they aren't in is in an individual discussion with me about the number that they need to deliver. So I can't comment on ALO by ALO, but if there's still some arm wrestling going on, then so be it.
Yeah. I mean, from the machinery of government, there was a letter sent to you as Chief Minister about the oversight and restructure of arm's length organisations. So is that something that's going to be sort of motivated in next year to maybe consolidate things down and reduce costs and provide better oversight?
We're working on that now. And I think we're agreed in the principle at ministerial level, but it's just about how any restructure or reorganisation might look like. And of course, we need to talk to the ALOs. I think we've given some indication, but we haven't had proper discussions with them yet. And that's something that's quite high on the agenda following the budget.
Yeah, PSC just yesterday published LO's your executive response for CNAG report, which was helpful with our comments, and we also would look at PSC to have a review.
Absolutely.
Can I just be clear, because one of them falls within my department, they are aware of their budget, and it's quite clear from the budget here what their budget cut is.
Okay, thank you. We're moving to risks to Deputy Miles.
Thank you. There seems to be some contradiction between the government's priorities for monitoring and future planning and the decision to reduce funding to Statistics Jersey in 2025, and we have discussed this at Corporate Services Scrutiny panel. And I think through the hearings that we've had and through the submissions from stakeholders, we've seen where reduced statistical outputs would affect the decision-making policy. So against the outcome indicators for future Jersey, the gender pay gap reporting is something that you raised yourself, economic and fiscal forecasting for Chief Minister, etc., etc. So were any of these areas identified when deciding to reduce the budget funding for Statistics Jersey?
So I can probably take some responsibility for that. They weren't discussed. They were discussed as such, but the one or two of the proposals by the Chief Statistician, because we're basing this on the professional advice of the Chief Statistician. It's not ministers that have said cut this, cut that, and cut that.
No, but it is ministers who have said to the Statistics Jersey, the Chief Statistician, that there is going to be a budget reduction. So really, you've put him in the position of having to make a choice.
Yes, but I mean, we've still seen since 2020. The Stats Department has had a 25% increase in their staffing levels. Again, and we have to respect the independence of the statistics unit, although we have a good working rapport with them. The new law changes that and gives them more autonomy, more independence. So it's sort of, I would like to see more cooperation between economy, statistics and statistics unit to make sure they're aligned and they actually know, they actually know what they need. Economy department, I think that's key. We need to know what we need for the economy, because we do a lot of the reports here that are quite nice to have, but actually we don't need them every year or every 3 months. Actually, I agree, and we found the money to put back the business tendency survey because there was sort of a gap with the advice, FPP advice and other advice is that we go to a more GVA approach on monitoring our economy, which would take over from the BTS, but of course that probably due to start in 26, so we had a gap. So yes, we provide additional funding to put that back.
I mean, it's interesting what you say there. You said that the statistics unit have had significant growth, and is one of the reasons that you're giving for taking the money off them because they've had growth in the past.
I mean, it's probably important to clarify here, as I've said already here and in other places, this Council of Ministers inherited growth bids from the previous Council of Ministers and took a 20% reduction across the board in those growth bids. Just to be clear. So if you were getting 100, you're now getting 80.
But the money's still with the budget.
But I think
The statistics unit was one of a number of places which had a growth bid that was cut.
But the issue that I'm raising here is about the risk assessment and the risk analysis. One of the reasons that the statistics unit had an increased budget over the past few years was because it was acknowledged. I mean, I say the same comment again. If you're going on a journey, you don't shred your map and stamp on your compass. Statistics Jersey is a very important function of the Cabinet Office to be able to provide evidence which guide policy, not only for states of Jersey, but also for our commercial businesses, for the finance industry. We've seen what the FPP have said about it. So what I think we're trying to get at was, were any of those things taken into account other than we will lose 20% from Cabinet Office and you decide how to do it?
Yes.
Okay.
100%.
So what
yes.
were the discussions around that then, please?
Discussions around that were discussions around all the changes in the Cabinet. If you take the Cabinet Office in particular, we had a lot of discussion around that and how they met their share of that curbing of the growth in public spending. The Chief Statistician, as Chief Minister mentioned, is independent, so it's not a case of going and saying we think we should do this or do that. The Chief Statistician came to the ELT with recommendations of where they felt that they could economise, whether that was taking an annual survey and doing it biannually, for example. They came with the recommendations, we debated and we decided, just as we did with lots of other areas as well. So they were in the same process as everyone else.
I understand how they're in the same process, but the implications of reducing the size of the statistics unit are not just for within government, it's for outside of government. So therefore, is the risk not higher of cutting their budget?
I think it's a matter of opinion.
So, I mean, Paul can correct me if I'm wrong. So 15 staff in 2020, peaked at 22 staff, and that's reduced to 19.
Yes.
So how they and there was those staff I believe were increased to 22
based on temporary funding.
Temporary funding for one-off all temporary work. So that came to an end. By the time that came to an end, it sort of almost become baked into the budget.
I'm not sure it was temporary funding rather than interim, but I'm going to move on because I'm conscious of time. But again, there seems to be a contradiction because a couple of sittings ago, we all agreed to adopt P29, which is the Draft Statistics and Census Law, which puts duties onto the Chief Statistician and it basically ensures that the government provide him with the right funding in order to discharge his functions. And again, there just seems to be the contradiction about withdrawing their funding, which doesn't help him deliver it doesn't help Statistics Jersey deliver their statutory functions.
Yes, I can't disagree with all of that, but there again, it was the Chief Statistician that made those recommendations. And I look forward to the next discussion, because the government have a duty to make sure they're appropriately funded, and we're going to work closely.
I mean, as you know, CSSP have got an amendment lodged
Yeah.
to restore the funding, and that is supported by the Statistics User Group. And that's the way that will move forward.
Yeah, understood.
But just as another area about Cabinet Office, you've also dissolved the delivery unit. And the delivery unit was put in place by the previous government to do just that, to deliver the ministerial priorities. So what are you using as an alternative mechanism to deliver the functions?
Okay, Andrew.
Yeah, I mean, the delivery unit, I think, was removed last summer.
Yes.
Yeah, last summer. We're placing the obligation on ministers and their departments to deliver rather than having someone try to deliver on behalf of them.
Okay, thank you. And at the same time, I understand that the responsibility for performance measurement has been devolved down into departments together with associated data collection.
Yes, although it's still brought together for the purposes of the Council of Ministers top-down grip.
Does the Cabinet Office still have a strategic planning and performance function?
Yes, but for the reasons we described, it is reduced, because this is more about ministerial grip and delivery.
Okay, and do you think there's a risk with devolving that sort of very important information down to departments who are already stretched due to the reductions in funding that they've had?
So I would go back to it's holding on ministers to grip their departments and chief officers to be held to account for.
And Andrew, you concerned about any additional risk? I think we could perhaps. I'm hoping we might see some improvements, but.
No, I mean, I think it's always better to allocate the workload the rest of the party best able to manage it, and I do not see how the delivery unit was best set up to manage the rest of the individual departments might not perform. I think that rests with individual departments.
But you acknowledge that there is a risk of devolving that.
There's a risk in every decision that you take, especially when you are dealing with very tight public finances as we are.
Thank you. As Chief Minister, you have a responsibility to ensure that your government respects and implements the decisions taken by the States Assembly.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that your budget ensures that all existing decisions can be taken forward within the current government term?
What, the existing outstanding decisions of the States Assembly?
Yes.
I'd need to have the list in front of me. There are some. The one that springs to mind is the Ombuds person, the work on that. But what we have undertaken, I've undertaken as Chief Minister in the Assembly on more than one occasion, to bring back any decision that the government decides it's not minded to proceed with to the Assembly for debate.
So that's your undertaking that you would bring.
No, we would bring it back, yeah, and that's not always been the case in the past.
Yeah, so we have several minutes left. We'll go around the table and it's like last questions
Can I
to
just
wrap
build
up.
on this one?
Yeah, sure, absolutely.
You mentioned the legislative programme and that it had been slimmed down. In terms of States Assembly decisions, does your legislative programme allow space for backbenchers, non-executive members to bring forward propositions to the Assembly and have those accepted?
Paul's trying to ask this, but I want to, it's important that we've, I mean, the legislative programme is based upon a realistic, the resources and a realistic programme of getting done what we put in. Of course, there's an element of making sure that what we put into the programme receives the relevant instructions. And there is flex in that for ministers to be able to bring things back and put other priorities in. So I think the short answer to that is yes.
Okay.
Paul, do you want to?
I think that's all I need to hear really. I think
Yeah,
President
it's
wants to-
about
yeah.
the flexibility that.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank
And,
you.
my final
sure.
question on the risk really was again just to have some undertaking from yourself that you'll provide progress reporting mechanism for updating the progress of this budget as we move through next year to improve transparency for the public.
I'd very much like to do that. Can I look to the Treasurer and what do we have in place for that internally? I mean, the monthly, the monitoring of spending, the financial management
So
is well in hand and
ELT regularly monitors financial performance as well as performance against each department's objectives. Quarterly, that's considered by ministers, and the Chief Minister discusses regularly progress against the 13 CSPs. We will obviously, in the year-end accounts, report performance against what was intended in the budget or government plan documentation and against those CSPs.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, let's go around. Deputy Constable, do you have another question to ask?
Yeah,
before we wrap
so
up?
you lodged this budget early compared to others. Do you think that your reasons for lodging early have been achieved while allowing scrutiny and other members enough time to scrutinise the budget themselves?
well, we lodged the budget early at the request of scrutiny, and so I hope it's helped. I think we can always learn, and I look forward to our post-budget. We can sit down and talk about what went well, what didn't go so well, so we can make further improvements for next year. But I think it was a step in the right direction. I hope the extra time has been helpful.
There seems to be quite a focus on devolvement to departments. So does the Chief Minister think there's sufficient consultation with stakeholders on department policy? And as an example, the CEHA panel has received quite a few submissions from different groups who are concerned that the new early years policy will cause them difficulties and even put them out of business. So just there
sorry,
doesn't
what
seem...
is the CEHA?
Children, Education and Home Affairs.
Okay, fine.
So
Sorry.
just that when departments are making the policies,
Into acronyms.
is there enough consultation going on with the
What
stakeholders?
With the first part of your question, devolve. What did you say? What the first part of the question?
Devolvement or the responsibilities of each department. So in each department, as new policy is made,
Yeah.
is there sufficient consultation with stakeholders? Because we are getting feedback that there isn't.
I would like to think there is. I suspect, being honest, that's not always the case. I can't think of any circumstance. We're always mindful to try and engage wherever possible. I make it a priority for ministers to consult and engage, but I know sometimes some things slip through. So that's, if and I say to scrutiny, please scrutinise us hard on that, or let us know if we do let something go below the radar. Certainly not intentional if we do.
Deputy Dublin?
Me, right, fine. Yes, Chief Minister, you spoke about general taxation needing to be increased, and that, is it fair to say you're not shying away from
I didn't
that?
say it needed to be increased. No, no. I said, how should health be paid for through general taxation?
Okay, I might ask that question again then, because the Health Minister said that there needed to be increased funding for health. And given that funds are already being cut in other areas, how will that increase in funds be obtained in order to meet all of the challenges that
To be clear,
Chief Executive-
I'm not currently, at this moment in time, in favour of increasing taxation in any way, shape or form.
Mm-hmm.
I think we need to, our tax rates are adequate. We need to work on growing our economy and increasing our revenues. And I believe that it's about prioritisation. Out of the 1.2, 1.3, 1.4 billion of income we get every year, we've got to make sure we prioritise that correctly across our ministerial, departmental jurisdictions. And health comes right up there. So that's how I believe at this moment in time we should be prioritising for it. I mean, there have been suggestions for it. We've seen other jurisdictions temporarily increase income tax, bring in health taxes. I'm not in favour. I don't think we're at that stage yet, and I'm not supportive of that. And I think the health minister has mentioned, that we could turn to that in the future. I'm not saying the states might not decide to do that, but right now I don't think we're in that place.
So are you confident that economic growth is going to be enough to fund the increased health needs?
For now, I am, and I'm not saying we're going to see exponential economic growth. We're in challenging times. Interest rates are still high. They're now forecast to come down a little bit slower than we thought they would. We're still recovering from the pandemic. We've got lots of challenges. So, I mean, that's why we need to balance the books, keep curb our expenditure and work together. But I think right now we can manage on the tax rates we've got, and we don't have to.
You quoted some stats there. Do you agree that it's really important to have robust statistical evidence behind so you can make these decisions?
Absolutely, I do, and that's why we've got a well-resourced stats department. We've just got to agree what stats they produce, and I'm quite happy to work with people on that.
As we heard that it's now more delegated to the department's performance management delivery, because we don't have a delivery unit. There is lots of things happening on the departmental level with LT coming together. Can you please let the panel know that we will follow through the year? What are ministerial group you have in place to ensure that the cross-cutting work is happening? And if I'm thinking about cross-cutting, if I'm thinking about education with the infrastructure, with the children, thinking about the digital, it's economy plus finance plus economy. There is lots of things happening on cross-departmental level. What are the ministerial groups do you have to work through this cross-cutting? If you have any?
We don't have a specific ministerial cross-cutting,
So what's
governmental
the
cross-cutting group, and I don't believe.
Cost of living group, isn't there?
cost of living group do you still have?
Got
haywire.
Regeneration, cost of living.
Oh, I see. So what? Oh, okay. So we've got we've got Housing Work Advisory Group. We've got Regeneration Steering Group.
So Housing Work Advisory Group are responsible for?
Housing and Work Advisory Group. So hardship applications, 218 applications, population policy led by
Population
DPLs,
policy.
and licensed what we used to call JCAT in.
Yeah, and skills, as we said,
Skills.
where you've got those areas that are cross-cutting, and you need to. So currently looking at, there's are there enough unqualified housing accommodation? Do we need to think about that supply? That affects back to your vulnerable islanders question. So there's lots of groups doing that.
I've just signed a ministerial order in the last couple of days to establish the cost of living
group.
support group.
So cost of living group coming back to be established, so we have cost.
It's been running throughout.
It's been running. It was running on a sort of. We've had a couple of meetings, and actually we've decided to formalise that now.
Is there still a future places group?
That's the regeneration steering group,
Yeah.
been renamed.
So we have cost of living, regeneration, and work and housing group.
Housing Work Advisory Group.
No, we don't need more, we just need to understand.
we have got-
We're just asking, I don't try to say you need to have more,
my
just
brain
to
feels
establish
like a
the
breeze
facts.
block at the
I'm not
moment.
sure it's much different from what it was before.
No.
So
Okay. Thank you. If it's no more any questions, I really thank you for your answers.
Thank you.
Thank you for officers who were supporting. Thank you for the public attending, and this public hearing is closed. Thank you.
very much. Thank you.
The dot of half past 3.
Yeah,
Not bad.
yeah. Exactly on time.